An alibi is supposed to prove you couldn't have committed a crime because you were somewhere else. These criminals proved they were exactly where they shouldn't have been. 1. A man in Florida was accused of robbing a gas station at gunpoint and told police he couldn't have done it because he was at home watching television during the robbery. Detectives asked what he was watching, and he described a football game in detail. Officers checked and found that the game he described had been played the previous week, not the night of the robbery. The suspect then changed his story and said he'd been watching a recording of the game. Detectives asked if he could show them the recording. The suspect admitted he didn't actually record it. Officers then pointed out that his cell phone had pinged off towers near the gas station at the exact time of the robbery. Phone records showed he'd made a call from near the crime scene minutes after the robbery. The suspect then changed his alibi again, claiming he'd been driving past the gas station but hadn't gone inside. Security footage showed him entering the store with a gun clearly visible. His face was uncovered and clearly identifiable. The "I was home watching TV" alibi fell apart within minutes of the first question. He was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 15 years. His constantly changing alibi was used by prosecutors to show consciousness of guilt. Innocent people don't need to keep changing their stories about where they were. 2. A woman accused of murdering her husband told police she'd been at her mother's house across town when he was killed. She said she'd been there all evening and her mother would confirm it. Detectives interviewed the mother, who initially supported her daughter's alibi. But when detectives mentioned they had the daughter's car on traffic cameras heading in the opposite direction from the mother's house at the time she claimed to be there, the mother broke down and admitted her daughter had asked her to lie. The daughter's car had been captured on automatic license plate readers heading toward her own house where the murder occurred. Her phone records showed she'd been texting her husband from her home address minutes before he was killed. Detectives also found her internet search history included "how long before a body starts to smell," searched the day before the murder. When confronted with the evidence, the woman admitted she'd lied about the alibi but claimed she'd found her husband already dead. The evidence showed she'd killed him. She was convicted of first-degree murder. Her easily disproven alibi helped establish premeditation since she'd arranged the false alibi before committing the murder. 3. A man accused of burglary claimed he'd been at a bar with friends during the break-in. He provided names of 3 friends who would verify his alibi. Detectives interviewed the friends. The first friend said yes, the suspect had been at the bar that night. The second friend said the suspect had been there but left for about an hour in the middle of the evening. The third friend said the suspect hadn't been there at all that night. When confronted with the conflicting stories, the suspect admitted he'd called his friends and asked them to lie, but apparently hadn't coordinated the details of the fake alibi. The burglary had occurred during the hour the second friend said the suspect had left the bar. Security cameras from the bar showed the suspect leaving at exactly the time the burglary took place and returning an hour later. His car was captured on a doorbell camera at the burglary location. The suspect was wearing the same distinctive jacket in the bar footage and the burglary footage. His poorly coordinated fake alibi with friends who couldn't keep their stories straight helped convict him. He received 5 years for burglary plus additional time for attempting to obstruct justice by arranging false alibis. 4. A woman accused of embezzling from her employer claimed she couldn't have made the fraudulent transfers because she'd been on vacation in Mexico during the dates in question. She showed investigators receipts from Mexican hotels and restaurants. Detectives checked her credit card statements and found she'd made purchases in her hometown on the same dates as the Mexican receipts. She'd purchased the Mexican receipts online from a website that sells fake travel documents to help people fake vacations. Her IP address was traced to her home computer, accessing her work accounts and making the fraudulent transfers during the exact hours she claimed to be on a beach in Cancun. Her social media showed no vacation photos, and she hadn't taken time off work during the dates in question. Co-workers confirmed she'd been in the office working normally. When confronted, she admitted she'd bought fake receipts thinking they'd provide an alibi. She was convicted of embezzlement and fraud. The fake vacation alibi actually made her case worse because it showed premeditation and sophistication in attempting to cover up the crimes. 5. A man accused of assaulting someone at a nightclub told police he'd left the club before the assault happened and had been at home asleep. He said he could prove it because his home security system showed him arriving home before the assault occurred. Detectives asked to see the security footage. The footage showed him arriving home, then leaving again 15 minutes later, and returning 2 hours later, a timeline perfectly matching when he could have gone back to the club, committed the assault, and returned home. His car's GPS showed he'd driven back toward the nightclub after initially arriving home. Witnesses at the club identified him as the attacker. His own security system that he thought would prove his alibi actually proved he'd lied about staying home. He was convicted of assault and received 3 years in prison. Detectives noted that if he'd simply not mentioned the security footage, they might not have checked it. But by offering it as evidence, he'd drawn attention to the proof of his lie. 6. A woman accused of stealing from a department store claimed she'd been shopping at a completely different store across town at the time of the theft. She provided a receipt from the other store timestamped during the theft. Detectives checked security footage from both stores. The footage showed her at the department store she'd allegedly stolen from, committing the theft, then driving across town to the other store where she made a small purchase to get a receipt for her alibi. The timestamps proved she'd been at the crime scene first, then created the alibi receipt afterward. Her credit card records confirmed she'd made the purchase at the department store she claimed not to have been at. She'd been so focused on creating proof she was somewhere else that she'd forgotten her credit card would prove she'd been at both places. She was convicted of retail theft. The fake alibi receipt actually helped prosecutors by showing she'd planned the theft in advance and attempted to create false evidence. 7. A man accused of vandalizing his ex-girlfriend's car told police he couldn't have done it because he'd been at work during the vandalism. He said his boss and co-workers could verify he'd been at work all day. Detectives contacted his employer who confirmed he'd been at work. But security cameras at the ex-girlfriend's apartment complex showed him vandalizing her car during what his employer confirmed was his lunch break. The timestamp on the footage showed the vandalism occurred during the 1-hour window he wasn't being monitored at work. His car was visible in the apartment complex footage. Witnesses in the complex recognized him. When confronted, he admitted he'd vandalized the car during lunch, but had hoped claiming he was at work all day would cover him. He was convicted of criminal damage to property. His technically true but misleading alibi that he'd been at work actually helped prosecution by showing he'd tried to deceive investigators rather than being upfront. 8. A woman accused of fraud claimed she couldn't have committed the crime because she'd been out of the country in Canada when the fraudulent transactions occurred. She showed investigators her passport with Canadian entry and exit stamps. Detectives checked with Canadian Border Services and found no record of her crossing the border on those dates. The passport stamps were fake, purchased online from the same document forgery service she'd used to commit the original fraud. Her phone records showed she'd never left the United States. Her credit cards showed purchases in her hometown during the dates she claimed to be in Canada. The IP addresses accessing the accounts to commit the fraud traced to her home internet connection. When confronted with the evidence, she admitted she'd forged the passport stamps, thinking they'd be convincing. She was convicted of fraud and received additional charges for passport forgery, a federal crime. Her fake international alibi turned a state fraud case into a federal case with harsher penalties. 9. A man accused of robbery told police he'd been at his grandmother's house during the crime, and his grandmother would confirm it. Detectives interviewed the grandmother, who was in her 80s and had dementia. She initially agreed her grandson had been there that day, but when asked what day it was, she thought it was Christmas. The alleged alibi visit had supposedly occurred in July. The grandmother's caretaker told detectives that the grandson hadn't visited in months and definitely wasn't there on the day of the robbery. The suspect's phone records showed he'd called his grandmother 3 times the morning before police questioned her, apparently trying to coach her to provide the alibi. Security footage from the robbery clearly showed the suspect's face and distinctive tattoos. His car was captured on cameras leaving the robbery location. The elderly grandmother with dementia alibi fell apart immediately. He was convicted of robbery and received additional charges for attempting to manipulate a vulnerable person to provide false testimony. The attempted use of his confused grandmother as a false alibi particularly angered the jury. 10. A woman accused of arson at her business claimed she'd been at a yoga class when the fire started. She said the yoga instructor and other students could verify she'd been there. Detectives interviewed the yoga instructor, who confirmed the woman had attended a class that day, but noted the class was in the morning and the fire had started in the evening. The woman then changed her story and said she'd mixed up the times. Detectives found security footage from a gas station near her business showing her purchasing a gas can and lighter fluid 2 hours before the fire. Her car was captured on traffic cameras heading toward her business at exactly the time fire investigators determined the arson occurred. Accelerant traces found at the fire scene matched the brand of lighter fluid she'd purchased. Cell phone records showed her phone at her business location when the fire started. The yoga class alibi would have been easily verifiable if she'd gotten the time right, but the 12-hour discrepancy made it immediately obvious she was lying. She was convicted of arson and insurance fraud. Her business had been failing and she'd set the fire to collect insurance money. The false alibi helped prove premeditation. 11. A man accused of assault claimed he'd been at a movie theater watching a specific film during the attack. He described the movie in detail and provided a ticket stub. Detectives checked with the theater and found the movie he claimed to have watched wasn't playing at that location that day. It had opened the previous week and finished its run. The ticket stub he'd shown was from the week before. He'd gone to see the movie, kept the ticket, and tried to use it as an alibi for an event that occurred a week later. Theater records showed he hadn't purchased any tickets on the day of the assault. Security footage from the area where the assault occurred showed him clearly visible. The victim identified him. Witnesses identified him. His outdated movie ticket alibi was immediately disproven with a single phone call to the theater. He was convicted of assault. The false alibi demonstrated consciousness of guilt and planning, helping prosecutors argue the attack was premeditated rather than a spontaneous altercation. 12. A woman accused of stealing from a coworker claimed she'd been in a meeting with several colleagues during the theft. She named 5 specific people who she said were in the meeting with her. Detectives interviewed all 5 people. 4 of them confirmed there had been a meeting that day, but said the accused woman had left the meeting for approximately 20 minutes, exactly when the theft occurred. The 5th person said the accused woman hadn't been in the meeting at all. Office security footage showed the accused woman leaving the meeting and going to the coworker's desk where the theft occurred. Surveillance captured her taking items from the desk and concealing them in her bag. She was seen returning to the meeting room minutes later. The stolen items were found in her car. Her alibi that she'd been in a meeting the entire time was instantly disproven by the very people she'd claimed would support her story. She was convicted of theft and fired from her job. Using coworkers as alibi witnesses when those same coworkers could easily disprove the story showed remarkably poor planning. 13. A man accused of dealing drugs claimed he'd been at his child's school play during the time of an alleged drug transaction. He said dozens of parents and teachers could confirm he'd been there. Detectives contacted the school and learned that the play had occurred the previous month, not on the date of the alleged drug deal. The suspect had attended his child's play and tried to use that real event as an alibi for something that happened weeks later. Undercover officers had recorded the drug transaction and clearly captured the suspect's voice and appearance. His phone records placed him at the location of the drug deal, not at any school. The school confirmed no events had occurred on the day in question. When confronted with the discrepancy, the suspect claimed he'd gotten dates confused. He was convicted of drug trafficking. His attempt to use a real past event as an alibi for a different date was easily disproven with basic fact-checking. The false alibi helped establish that he knew he'd committed the crime and was trying to fabricate a defense. 14. A woman accused of vandalizing her neighbor's property told police she'd been at work during the vandalism. She said her employer and security badge swipes would prove she'd been in her office. Detectives contacted her employer, who confirmed she'd badged into the building that day, but security logs showed she'd also badged out mid-morning and hadn't badged back in until afternoon. The vandalism had occurred during the hours she was out of the office. Her car was captured on the neighbor's security camera during exactly those hours. The footage clearly showed her committing the vandalism. She was wearing her work ID badge on a lanyard around her neck in the footage, ironically proving it was her. When confronted, she admitted she'd left work, committed the vandalism, and returned to work, hoping no one would notice she'd been gone. She was convicted of criminal damage. Her employer fired her for leaving work without permission to commit crimes. The "I was at work" alibi that she thought was foolproof was destroyed by the same security system she'd relied on to create the alibi. 15. A man accused of burglary claimed he'd been fishing at a lake 30 miles away when the break-in occurred. He said he'd been alone but could prove it because he'd posted photos on social media from the lake. Detectives checked his social media and found fishing photos posted from the lake on the day in question. But the photo metadata showed the images had been taken 2 weeks earlier and posted on the day of the burglary with backdated timestamps. His phone's GPS records showed he'd been near the burglary location, not at the lake. Security cameras from a convenience store near the crime scene showed him purchasing gloves and a crowbar hours before the break-in. His car was identified at the scene. Stolen property was found in his home. The social media alibi using old photos with fake timestamps was easily disproven by examining the digital evidence. He was convicted of burglary. Detectives noted that most people don't realize photo metadata includes original timestamp and location data that can't be changed just by editing post dates. 16. A woman accused of assault claimed she'd been at a hair salon getting her hair done during the attack. She provided the name of the salon and said the stylist would remember her. Detectives visited the salon and spoke to the stylist, who said the woman had indeed been there for an appointment, but it had been in the morning and the assault occurred in the evening. The salon's appointment records confirmed the time discrepancy. The woman then claimed she'd had a second appointment that evening, but the salon had been closed by then. Security footage from the location of the assault clearly showed the woman attacking the victim. Witnesses identified her. Her phone records placed her at the assault location at the time it occurred. The hair salon alibi with a 6-hour time gap was immediately disproven. She was convicted of assault. Her attempt to use a real appointment at the wrong time as an alibi showed she'd at least tried to create a semi-believable story, but didn't think to check when the salon actually closed. 17. A man accused of credit card fraud claimed he couldn't have made the fraudulent purchases because he'd been at church during the times the cards were used. He provided his pastor as an alibi witness. Detectives spoke to the pastor, who confirmed the man attended church but said services were only on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings. The fraudulent purchases had been made on Tuesday afternoon, Thursday morning, and Saturday night, times when no church services occurred. The man then claimed he'd been at the church for prayer and Bible study sessions. The pastor said the church was locked when not in use and the man didn't have keys. Security footage from the stores where the fraudulent purchases were made clearly showed the accused man using stolen credit cards. His car was identified in parking lot footage. He was convicted of credit card fraud. His attempt to hide behind church attendance as a blanket alibi for all times fell apart when the pastor clarified the actual church schedule. The jury seemed particularly offended by his attempt to use religious activities as cover for criminal behavior. 18. A woman accused of embezzlement from her employer told investigators she couldn't have made the unauthorized transactions because she'd been on maternity leave during the months in question. She provided hospital records of giving birth and said she'd been home with her newborn the entire time. Detectives checked her work computer access logs and found she'd logged into the company system remotely dozens of times during her supposed maternity leave. The fraudulent transactions had been made from her IP address during these remote login sessions. Bank records showed the stolen money being deposited into accounts she controlled. Her own detailed work logs from the remote sessions proved she'd been actively working and embezzling while claiming to be on leave. She'd apparently thought maternity leave meant she wouldn't be suspected of workplace crimes, not realizing that all computer access is logged regardless of where you're working from. She was convicted of embezzlement. Her maternity leave alibi actually made the premeditation more clear, since she'd set up remote access specifically to continue stealing while on leave. 19. A man accused of robbery told police he'd been at the hospital visiting a sick relative when the robbery occurred. He provided the name of the hospital and the relative he'd been visiting. Detectives contacted the hospital and found the relative had indeed been a patient there, but had been discharged 3 days before the robbery. Hospital security had no record of the man visiting on the day of the robbery. Visitor logs showed he'd visited his relative earlier in the week, but not on the relevant date. The man then claimed he must have gotten his dates mixed up. Security cameras from the robbery location clearly showed his face. The victim identified him in a lineup. DNA evidence placed him at the scene. His phone records showed him at the robbery location, not at the hospital. The hospital alibi using a real visit on the wrong date was immediately disproven. He was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 12 years. His attempt to use a legitimate hospital visit as an alibi for a crime days later showed poor understanding of how easily dates can be verified. 20. A woman accused of insurance fraud claimed she'd been in a car accident while driving alone and someone had rear-ended her and fled. She filed an insurance claim for injuries and vehicle damage. Insurance investigators found traffic camera footage from the intersection where she claimed the accident occurred. The footage showed her driving her car into a pole deliberately while the intersection was empty. No other vehicles were present. She'd staged the entire accident. Her phone records showed she'd called her insurance company minutes after hitting the pole. Medical records showed her injuries were consistent with the pole collision, not a rear-end collision as claimed. When confronted with the video evidence, she admitted she'd needed money and thought she could fake an accident for insurance payout. She was convicted of insurance fraud. Her "someone hit me and drove off" alibi was destroyed by traffic cameras she didn't know existed. She ended up owing restitution to the insurance company, paying fines and serving probation for a scheme that netted her nothing but criminal charges. 21. A man accused of assault claimed he'd been at home with his girlfriend watching Netflix when the attack occurred. He said his girlfriend and his Netflix viewing history would prove he'd been home. Detectives spoke to the girlfriend, who initially confirmed he'd been home. But when detectives mentioned they had cell phone records showing his location, the girlfriend admitted he'd left for several hours that evening, and she'd agreed to lie for him. Netflix records showed someone had been watching from his account, but the viewing had been paused for 2 hours, exactly when the assault occurred, suggesting someone hit play and left. His phone's GPS tracked him leaving his house, going to the assault location, staying there for the duration of the attack, and returning home. The victim identified him. Witnesses at the scene identified him. His watching Netflix alibi fell apart because streaming services don't actually prove you're watching, just that your account is playing something. He was convicted of aggravated assault. His girlfriend was charged with providing false testimony to police. 22. A woman accused of shoplifting told security guards she couldn't have stolen anything because she'd been shopping with her sister the entire time, and her sister would confirm she didn't take anything. Security called the police and detained both women. When officers separated them for interviews, the sister immediately told police that the accused woman had stolen items and put them in her purse. The sister said she'd tried to stop her and didn't want to be involved. Store security footage clearly showed the theft. The stolen merchandise was found in the accused woman's purse. Her alibi witness instantly became a witness for the prosecution. She was convicted of retail theft. Detectives noted that using family members as alibis is particularly risky because family members often won't commit perjury for you, especially when video evidence makes the lie pointless. 23. A man accused of drug dealing claimed he'd been at a medical appointment across town when police observed him making drug sales. He provided the name of his doctor and said appointment records would prove his alibi. Detectives contacted the doctor's office, which confirmed the man had an appointment scheduled that day, but he'd called and canceled it that morning. The office had documentation of the cancellation call. Surveillance video from undercover police clearly showed the suspect making drug transactions at exactly the time he claimed to be at the doctor. Multiple officers testified to witnessing the drug sales. Drugs and cash were found on him when arrested. His medical appointment alibi was instantly disproven with one phone call to verify he'd canceled. He was convicted of drug trafficking. The attempted alibi using a canceled appointment showed poor planning since cancellation records are standard documentation that's easy to verify. 24. A woman accused of arson claimed she'd been at a book club meeting when her business burned down. She provided names of 5 book club members who could verify she'd been there. Detectives interviewed all 5 women. 4 of them confirmed there had been a book club meeting, but said the accused woman had never shown up that night. The 5th woman admitted the accused had called her asking her to lie and say she'd been there, but the woman had refused. Phone records showed the accused woman had been near her business when the fire started. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed her car at her shop. At the time, fire investigators determined the arson occurred. Accelerant residue was found on her clothing. Insurance records showed she'd increased her business's fire insurance coverage 3 weeks before the fire. The book club alibi was completely false. She hadn't attended, and 4 of her 5 supposed alibi witnesses contradicted her story. She was convicted of arson and insurance fraud. The failed alibi helped prosecutors demonstrate premeditation, since she'd arranged it before committing the crime. 25. A man accused of burglary told police he'd been playing video games online with friends during the break-in. He said his gaming logs would show he'd been online during the crime. Detectives checked his gaming account and found he had been logged in during the time of the burglary, but his character had been standing still in one location not doing anything for over an hour. Exactly the duration of the burglary. His gaming friends confirmed they'd noticed he was logged in, but not actually playing. One friend said he'd sent multiple chat messages asking if the suspect was AFK, away from keyboard, and gotten no response. The suspect had logged into the game and then left to commit the burglary, thinking the login would be his alibi. Security footage from the burglary clearly showed him breaking in. His DNA was found at the scene. Stolen property was found in his home. The gaming alibi that showed he was logged in but not actually playing was worthless. He was convicted of burglary. Detectives noted that online activity logs are increasingly being used to disprove alibis, since they show not just that you were logged in, but whether you were actually actively using the service. 26. A woman accused of fraud claimed she'd been out of town on a business trip when the fraudulent transactions occurred. She provided hotel receipts and airline tickets showing she'd traveled to another state. Detectives checked with the airline and found she'd booked the flight but never checked in and never boarded the plane. The hotel confirmed she'd made a reservation but canceled it the day before her supposed trip. Her credit card records showed charges in her hometown during the dates she claimed to be traveling. Security footage from her workplace showed her coming to the office during the days she claimed to be away. The fraudulent transactions had been made from her work computer during the supposed business trip. She'd apparently booked travel to create paper evidence of an alibi, but never actually gone, not realizing that airlines and hotels keep records of no-shows and cancellations. She was convicted of fraud. The fake business trip alibi complete with receipts was easily disproven by verifying she'd never actually traveled. 27. A man accused of assault claimed he'd been at the gym working out when the attack occurred. He said gym staff and other gym members could verify he'd been there. Detectives visited the gym and checked the electronic check-in system. Records showed he'd scanned his membership card to enter the gym hours before the assault, but he'd never scanned out, and the gym's security footage showed him leaving through an emergency exit shortly after checking in. Camera footage tracked him leaving the gym, driving to the assault location, committing the attack, and returning to the gym where he scanned out normally. He'd apparently checked into the gym, left through the unmonitored emergency exit to commit the assault, returned, and checked out hoping the gym logs would show he'd been there the entire time. Multiple cameras caught him leaving and returning. The victim identified him. Witnesses identified him. His gym alibi was destroyed by the very security system he'd hoped would support his story. He was convicted of aggravated assault. The elaborate plan to create a false gym alibi was undone by cameras he didn't know were tracking the emergency exits. 28. A woman accused of theft from a store claimed she'd been at a doctor's appointment on the other side of town when the shoplifting occurred. She provided the doctor's name and appointment time. Detectives called the doctor's office, which confirmed she'd had an appointment that day, but it had ended 2 hours before the theft occurred. The appointment had been at 10 a.m. and ended at 10:30 a.m. The theft occurred at 1 p.m. Her car's license plate was captured on automatic readers traveling from the doctor's office to the mall where the theft occurred. Store security footage clearly showed her shoplifting. She was wearing the same outfit she'd worn to the doctor's appointment, which was confirmed by the medical office's security cameras. The doctor's appointment alibi that wasn't during the crime was worthless. She was convicted of retail theft. Her attempt to use a real appointment that happened hours earlier showed poor understanding of how alibis need to cover the actual time of the crime. 29. A man accused of vandalism told police he'd been at a sports bar watching a football game with friends when the vandalism occurred. He provided names of 3 friends in the name of the bar. Detectives visited the bar and checked with the manager, who confirmed the man and his friends had been there that evening, but had left during halftime and returned after the game ended. The vandalism had occurred during exactly that window when they'd left. Bar security cameras showed them leaving and returning. The man's car was captured on traffic cameras heading toward the vandalism location. Security footage from the vandalism site clearly showed him committing the crime. When confronted, he admitted he'd left the bar, vandalized his ex-girlfriend's property, and returned to the bar thinking the alibi of watching the game would cover him. He was convicted of criminal damage. His friends were also questioned about whether they'd participated or known about his plan. The halftime crime spree was easily proven by cameras at the bar showing his departure and return. 30. A woman accused of embezzlement claimed she couldn't have made the unauthorized transfers because she'd been on vacation in Hawaii when they occurred. She showed investigators vacation photos on her phone from Hawaii beaches. Detectives examined the photos' metadata and found they'd been downloaded from the internet, not taken by her camera. She'd found stock photos of Hawaii beaches online and saved them to her phone. Her credit cards showed no purchases in Hawaii and no airline tickets. Her social media had no posts about a Hawaii trip. Co-workers confirmed she'd been working normally during the time she claimed to be in Hawaii. The embezzled money had been transferred from her work computer during her normal business hours. She'd apparently thought showing photos of Hawaii beaches on her phone would be convincing without considering that photo metadata reveals the truth. She was convicted of embezzlement and fraud. The fake Hawaii vacation alibi using downloaded stock photos was perhaps the least sophisticated alibi attempt detectives had seen. 31. A man accused of assault claimed he'd been at his daughter's dance recital when the attack occurred. He said dozens of parents and the dance school staff could confirm his presence. Detectives contacted the dance school and learned the recital had occurred the previous weekend, not on the date of the assault. The school provided the actual recital date from their calendar. The suspect had attended his daughter's recital and tried to use that real event as an alibi for something that happened a week later. Security footage from the assault location clearly showed him attacking the victim. His phone records placed him at the assault scene. The victim and witnesses identified him. When confronted with the date discrepancy, he claimed he'd mixed up dates but eventually admitted he'd lied. He was convicted of assault. His attempt to use a real event from the wrong week was easily disproven with basic date verification. The dance school provided documentation that proved he was lying. 32. A woman accused of fraud told investigators she'd been attending a wedding in another state when the fraudulent transactions occurred. She provided photos from the wedding and names of people who could verify she'd been there. Detectives contacted the bride and groom who confirmed the woman had been invited to the wedding, but hadn't attended. They had a final head count that didn't include her because she'd never RSVP'd. The wedding photos she'd shown were taken from the couple's social media. She'd downloaded photos from their wedding and pretended she'd been there. Her credit card records showed charges in her hometown during the wedding date. The fraud had been committed from her home computer during the hours she claimed to be at a wedding. She was convicted of fraud. Her fake wedding attendance using other people's photos was easily disproven by asking the couple if she'd actually been there. Detectives noted that using major events like weddings as fake alibis is particularly easy to disprove, since such events have guest lists, seating charts, and RSVPs. 33. A man accused of burglary claimed he'd been in jail on different charges when the break-in occurred, making it impossible for him to have committed the crime. He said jail records would prove he couldn't have done it. Detectives checked with the jail and found he'd been released 3 days before the burglary. Jail records showed his exact release date and time. He'd been free when the burglary occurred. Security footage clearly showed him breaking into the building. DNA evidence linked him to the scene. Stolen property was found in his possession. His "I was in jail" alibi was instantly disproven with a single phone call to verify custody records. He was convicted of burglary. Detectives noted that claiming to be incarcerated when records are easily accessible is one of the dumbest possible alibis, since jail custody records are precisely documented. The false alibi showed he'd committed more crimes within days of being released from jail on previous charges. 34. A woman accused of theft claimed she'd been at a yoga class when the theft occurred. She provided the name of the studio and said the instructor would remember her. Detectives visited the yoga studio and spoke to the instructor, who said the woman had attended classes there in the past but hadn't been there on the date in question. The studio kept electronic attendance records for all classes, and the woman wasn't logged in that day. Security footage from the store where the theft occurred clearly showed her committing the crime at exactly the time she claimed to be at yoga. She was wearing yoga pants in the security footage, apparently having dressed for yoga but gone shoplifting instead. Her car was identified leaving the store parking lot. Stolen merchandise was found in her car. The yoga class alibi with no attendance record was easily disproven. She was convicted of theft. The irony of dressing for yoga but going shoplifting instead was noted by the prosecutor at trial. 35. A man accused of assault claimed he'd been at work during the attack. He said his time card would prove he'd clocked in and was working at the time. Detectives contacted his employer and got his time card records. The records showed he'd clocked in that morning but had clocked out for lunch just before the assault occurred. He'd clocked back in after lunch, exactly when the assault had ended. The assault occurred during his lunch break. His car was captured on traffic cameras traveling from his workplace to the assault location and back. Security footage showed him committing the assault while wearing his work uniform. Co-workers confirmed he'd left for lunch and returned. His "I was at work" alibi that ignored his lunch break was destroyed by his own employer's timekeeping records. He was convicted of assault and fired from his job for committing crimes during work hours while wearing the company uniform. 36. A woman accused of insurance fraud claimed she'd been grocery shopping when someone broke into her house and stole valuables. She filed an insurance claim for the stolen items. Insurance investigators found her grocery store receipt showing purchases made at the time she claimed to be shopping. But store security footage showed she'd used the self-checkout, scanned one item, paid for it to get a receipt, then abandoned her shopping cart and left the store. She'd created a receipt for alibi purposes without actually shopping. Her phone's GPS showed she'd been at her own house during the time she claimed to be shopping. Investigators determined she'd staged the burglary herself to collect insurance money. No signs of forced entry were found. Her stolen valuables were later discovered in a storage unit she'd rented. She was convicted of insurance fraud and filing false police reports. The fake shopping alibi using a receipt for one item was easily disproven by actual store footage showing she hadn't really shopped. 37. A man accused of selling drugs claimed he'd been at a family barbecue with 20 relatives who could all verify his whereabouts during the alleged drug transaction. He provided a list of names and phone numbers. Detectives began calling the family members. The first three confirmed there had been a family barbecue that weekend, but it had been on Saturday, and the drug transaction occurred on Sunday. The fourth family member said there had been no barbecue at all recently. The fifth said the suspect hadn't attended the last family gathering. None of the family members' stories aligned. Undercover officers had video and audio recordings of the drug transaction, clearly showing and identifying the suspect. His phone records placed him at the transaction location on Sunday, not at any family member's house. The family barbecue alibi with conflicting stories from supposed witnesses fell apart immediately. He was convicted of drug trafficking. Detectives noted that using multiple family members as alibi witnesses is risky because if they're not all lying, the truth comes out quickly. 38. A woman accused of vandalism told police she'd been at a spa getting a massage when the vandalism occurred. She said spa staff and appointment records would verify she'd been there. Detectives called the spa, which confirmed she'd had an appointment booked, but had canceled it that morning via phone. The spa still had the cancellation in their system with timestamp. Security footage from the vandalism location clearly showed her committing the crime at the exact time she was supposed to be at the spa. Her car was identified at the scene. The vandalism was against her ex-boyfriend's property, and she'd sent him threatening text messages earlier that day. The spa appointment alibi that she'd canceled was immediately disproven. She was convicted of criminal damage and harassment. The spa's cancellation records proved she'd freed up her schedule specifically to commit the vandalism. 39. A man accused of robbery claimed he'd been at home sick in bed when the robbery occurred. He said his roommate could verify he'd been home all day too ill to leave the house. Detectives interviewed the roommate who said the accused man had indeed been home that morning but had left in the afternoon, exactly when the robbery occurred. The roommate said he'd seemed fine, not sick. Security footage from the robbery clearly showed the accused man's face. The victim identified him in a lineup. His car was captured on traffic cameras near the robbery location. When confronted with the contradictions, the roommate admitted the accused had asked him to say he'd been home all day sick. But the roommate couldn't lie once police explained he'd be charged with obstruction if he provided false testimony. The homesick alibi was undermined by his own roommate telling the truth. He was convicted of armed robbery. The attempted use of a roommate as an alibi witness failed when the roommate chose honesty over loyalty. 40. A woman accused of assault claimed she'd been at a hair salon getting her hair dyed when the attack occurred. She showed up to the police station with freshly dyed hair as supposed proof. But detectives checked with the salon she named and found she had no appointment that day, and staff didn't recognize her photo. Chemical analysis of her hair showed the dye had been applied at least a week earlier, not the day of the assault. Security footage from the assault location showed her attacking the victim, and notably showed her hair was already dyed at the time of the assault. The hair color wasn't new. The victim identified her. Witnesses identified her. Her attempt to use freshly dyed hair as proof of a salon alibi was destroyed by the chemical evidence showing the dye was old and the salon having no record of her. She was convicted of assault. The hair dye alibi was particularly dumb since she'd apparently dyed her own hair days or weeks earlier and thought it could serve as proof of a non-existent salon appointment on a specific day. 41. A man accused of burglary told police he couldn't have committed the break-in because he'd been at a restaurant having dinner with his wife at the time. He provided the restaurant name and said credit card records would prove it. Detectives checked his credit card statement and found a charge from that restaurant on that day. But when they contacted the restaurant and checked the timestamp, the charge was from lunchtime, not dinner time. The burglary had occurred in the evening. The man had eaten lunch at the restaurant and tried to use that receipt as an alibi for a crime that happened hours later. Security footage from the burglary clearly showed him breaking in during the evening. His car was identified at the scene. His DNA was found on a tool left behind. The lunch receipt as an evening alibi was obviously worthless. He was convicted of burglary. His attempt to stretch one restaurant visit into an all-day alibi showed poor understanding of how timestamps work. 42. A woman accused of fraud claimed she'd been at a religious retreat at a mountain monastery when the fraudulent transactions occurred. She said the monks running the retreat could verify her attendance. Detectives contacted the monastery, which confirmed they'd held a retreat that week, but the woman had not attended. The monastery kept detailed records of all retreat participants, and she wasn't on the list. She'd never registered or paid for the retreat. Her credit card records showed transactions in her hometown during the retreat dates. The fraud had been committed from her home computer during the hours she claimed to be at a mountain monastery with no internet access. She was convicted of fraud. Her attempt to use a religious retreat as an alibi was easily disproven by contacting the actual monastery, which kept meticulous attendance records. The prosecutor noted at trial that falsely claiming to be on a religious retreat to cover criminal activity was particularly offensive given the nature of the lie. 43. A man accused of assault claimed he'd been donating blood at a blood donation center when the attack occurred. He said donation records would prove his alibi. Detectives contacted the blood donation center, which confirmed he was a regular donor but hadn't donated on the date in question. Their computer system showed his last donation had been 6 weeks earlier. Donors must wait 56 days between whole blood donations. The center's security cameras showed he hadn't been there on the assault date. Security footage from the assault location clearly showed him attacking the victim. Multiple witnesses identified him. His phone records placed him at the assault scene. The blood donation alibi was instantly disproven by donation center records. He was convicted of assault. Detectives noted that using blood donation as an alibi is particularly easy to disprove, since donation centers keep meticulous computer records of every donation for safety reasons. 44. A woman accused of theft claimed she'd been at a library studying when the theft occurred. She said library staff could verify she'd been there and that security cameras would show her in the building. Detectives visited the library and checked security footage. The footage showed her entering the library, staying for 10 minutes, then leaving. The theft occurred an hour after she'd left the library. She'd gone to the library briefly, apparently trying to get herself on camera to create an alibi, then left to commit the theft. Her car was captured on traffic cameras traveling from the library to the theft location. Store security clearly showed her committing the theft. She was wearing the same clothes in both the library footage and the theft footage. The library alibi that didn't cover the right time period was worthless. She was convicted of theft. Her attempt to manufacture alibi footage by briefly visiting the library didn't account for the fact that timestamps would reveal she'd left long before the crime occurred. 45. And finally, a man accused of murder told police he couldn't have killed the victim because he'd been in a different state visiting a friend when the murder occurred. He provided the friend's name, address, and phone number. Detectives called the friend, who immediately said, "He told me he was going to use me as an alibi, and I told him I wouldn't lie for him." The friend confirmed the accused man had never visited during the time in question. Phone records showed the accused man had called the friend multiple times trying to convince him to provide a false alibi, but the friend had refused. Security camera footage placed the accused at the victim's house at the time of the murder. DNA evidence linked him to the crime scene. His car was identified near the victim's home. Multiple pieces of forensic evidence connected him to the murder. The out-of-state friend alibi was destroyed before detectives even had to investigate it because the supposed alibi witness immediately told them it was a lie and that the accused had tried to arrange it in advance. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. His attempt to set up a fake alibi by calling a friend and asking him to lie completely backfired when the friend chose to tell the truth. The recorded phone calls of him trying to arrange the false alibi were used by prosecutors to show consciousness of guilt and premeditation. The friend testified at trial about the multiple calls asking him to lie, which helped establish that the defendant knew he'd committed murder and was trying to fabricate evidence before he'd even been arrested. The brutal truth about alibis is that they're only useful if they're true, verifiable, and actually cover the time of the crime. These criminals proved that making up an alibi is worse than having no alibi at all, because a false alibi shows consciousness of guilt. Innocent people don't need to lie about where they were. Every one of these fake alibis was easily disproven through basic investigation, checking timestamps, calling witnesses, reviewing records, examining surveillance footage, or looking at phone data. The criminals had put effort into creating stories that seemed plausible but fell apart the moment anyone verified the details. The real stupidity wasn't just the bad alibis. It was thinking that modern investigation couldn't quickly verify every claim. In an age of surveillance cameras, GPS tracking, electronic records, and timestamp metadata, claiming to be somewhere you weren't is almost guaranteed to be disproven. These criminals would have been better off remaining silent instead of volunteering lies that proved they knew they were guilty. Subscribe if you want to remember that lying to police makes you look guilty, even if they don't have evidence yet, that every alibi claim will be verified, and that the easily disproven alibi is one of the most common ways criminals accidentally prove their own guilt before investigators even have enough evidence to charge them.